friends, welcome back to Food Prep Guide. Today's video is another canning safety video, once again based on some chatter and some trends that I'm seeing on social media, where some are safe, some are absolutely not safe. It's generating a whole lot of confusion for brand new canners, so I want to discuss that, and that is dry canning. Dry canning, I have been seeing people use the term dry canning to refer to multiple different things, whether it's true dry canning or oven canning or vacuum sealing dry goods in mason jars. People are using the term dry canning for all of those scenarios. Some of them are safe, some of them are absolutely not safe. And I think people who are turning to social media to learn how to can, which in one way is fantastic, that more and more people are getting interested in food preservation and turning to those old ways of preserving food long term. But unfortunately, social media is also a place where you have multiple voices saying different things that contradict each other, and it can lead to some confusion. So I want to talk about each of those items: dry canning, oven canning, vacuum sealing dry goods and mason jars. I want to talk to you about what each one of those are and the differences between them and whether or not they are safe. Let's get started.
By the way, if you would like help building your food storage, scroll down to the description box of this video and click this link for our free 1-year food storage plan. We calculated a year's supply of food for one person, then broke that data down into a week by week list of items to build your pantry on a budget. We'll send it straight to your inbox. If you're new here, we invite you to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss all of our upcoming food preservation, pantry storage, and gardening tutorials. Now back to the kitchen.
So let's talk about the first method that people are using dry canning to describe, and that is putting dry goods in mason jars and then vacuum sealing them. I just have some Rice Krispies here. This is something that we keep on hand to make our granola, our homemade granola, and I'm just going to pour it into this quart jar real quick. And this, of the three methods that we're going to be discussing today, this one is the only one that is not debated as far as its safety goes. You're always going to have two or more camps of opinions on any given thing about whether, especially that's no different when it comes to canning, as which unfortunately it even comes to canning safety as far as what people think is safe and what is not safe. But when it comes to vacuum sealing dry goods in mason jars, that is absolutely safe, not debatable. So you just need some sort of, you need a mason jar sealer attachment. This is actually from the brand Food Saver, but from what I understand, a whole lot of different brands are making them now. This is a brake bleeder. All I'm going to do is pump until the needle stops, and it's going to end up giving us a vacuum seal. You can absolutely do this with a vacuum sealer machine, using electricity to vacuum seal it out. It's a lot easier on your arm muscles for sure. They also make little canisters that sit on top of the lid. I actually have one. I need to take that out, show it to y'all. Okay, the needle has stopped. So now we have a good solid vacuum seal. Lid's not coming off, tap tap, high pitched, so we're good. I can put this ring on, and this quart jar of Rice Krispies are going to stay good for probably about a year and not get stale on me as they would in the pantry in just the regular cardboard box that they come in. So if someone is using the term dry canning to refer to putting dry goods in mason jars and then sealing them, that is safe. The issue with that is, so I'm not one to nitpick over word choice. You can ask my husband. We joke all the time that I am a writer, not a talker, and that's because I stumble over my words so often. I will use like the most random wrong word for something that I totally didn't mean. So I'm not one to nitpick over word choice. And I hope that's not what I'm doing here today. I just think that there's a lot of confusion going on with what dry canning is, and when that confusion affects safety, I think it's important to address. And I know for a fact that this is happening because I'm seeing it all over Facebook groups, but also even people emailing in to Food Prep Guide and asking. We had someone ask specifically about dry canning. They said they got all their supplies, they're excited to get started, and they were going to do this and this and this in their oven. And I was just like, oh no. And I'm so glad they emailed in, because that gave me the opportunity to let them know that that wasn't safe. It was something that they saw on a TikTok video, and they just thought it was safe because they just didn't know, and you don't know what you don't know, and that's, you know, that's true with everyone, and you shouldn't feel bad about thinking that something is safe when it's not because you saw it on social media. We just need to take the time to research things ourselves, especially from reputable sources, from books, and not just stick strictly to social media. So I am not trying to nitpick on the word choice of dry canning. I'm not trying to attack it specifically. I am just wanting to bring clarification to those who hear the term dry canning and aren't sure what it means. So for instance, this lady who emailed in, she was going to be thinking about dry canning potatoes because she saw a tutorial for dry canning potatoes, and she had previously seen a tutorial for dry canning flour in a mason jar using the method that I had just shown you, because the video that she watched called what I just showed you dry canning. They said, this is how to dry can flour and preserve flour and make it last for years. Well, then she saw another tutorial, like I said, about dry canning potatoes. And since she had already seen dry canning flour, know that it was safe, she automatically thought that that other recipe was safe. So that's what I'm addressing today. So this is called vacuum sealing in a mason jar. We don't refer to this as canning, and it's not what most people are referring to when they say dry canning. So let's talk about method number 2, which is oven canning. So oven canning is, again, mostly with dry foods, people who are wanting to preserve their rice and dried beans, flour, grains, oats, things like that. And they are pouring them into their mason jars, putting the lid on, not vacuum sealing it. Let me pull that off. So they're putting their lid on, putting the ring on. They will turn it upside down and place it inside their oven. And then they will turn the oven on to around 200 degrees Fahrenheit to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. The idea behind dry canning, which is in this method, is actually called oven canning. But again, people are referring to oven canning as dry canning, and it's causing confusion. So this method would be called oven canning, 200 to 250 degrees, and the idea is that they are providing just enough heat, bringing up the heat slowly, and providing just enough heat so that there's a difference in temperature levels when they take those jars out, enough of a difference in temperature levels to cause that seal to go down and seal and lock down and create a vacuum seal. And for some people will do it straight up, some people will do it down. The thought process is that the weight of this food is pushing out air from the bottom, and so that's kind of where that upside down jars in the oven canning method came from. It's just the idea of pushing even more air out, and then when they transfer those hot jars onto their countertops, as the heat cools, it's going to cause that lid to suction down and create a vacuum seal. So I have two different opinions on this. One is, well, let me just tell you, the main reason why oven canning of dry goods specifically, I'm not talking about liquid, only dry goods, rice, beans, oats, flour, that kind of thing. The only issue you're going to run into is shattering your jar. As long as you are doing only dry goods, the things that I just listed, you're not going to be dealing with botulism risk because the botulism isn't even in those. Botulism requires moisture to thrive and even grow and exist. So you're not going to be dealing with like a botulism issue or food poisoning issue. You're just going to be dealing with the potential risk of your jar shattering. That's because mason jars, the way that the glass is created, from what I understand, is that they are designed for moist heat, not dry heat. So when they're exposed to dry heat for a long amount of time, and the oven canning process uses at least 1 hour, if not 2 to 3 hours. So having that dry heat on them for such a long time can cause that jar to shatter because there's no moisture involved. It's not, I think the word is tempered glass is this way, that it's not designed for dry heat. I'm not 100% sure on that. But I have absolutely seen, I've never done oven canning because I don't think it's a good idea. I'm just, the way that the price is on canning jars these days, it's like, why would I want to risk my jar shattering, especially when I have seen pictures on social media of just sad pictures of someone with shattered glass all over their oven. And sometimes, even worse, it happens when they're taking the jars out of the oven or they're sitting on the counter and then it shatters as it changes from hot to cold. It shatters, and even worse, if someone is standing there at the counter or even just walking through the kitchen when that glass shatters, someone could actually get injured. So for that reason, I don't oven can at all, even though it's not going to be a botulism risk or a food poisoning risk. It is the risk of shattering your jars. Now, something else, I haven't seen this yet, but the way that things are going on TikTok and Facebook and social media trends, I wouldn't put it past people to attempt to do oven canning with wet ingredients. And I've actually have seen a picture of someone doing it with tomato sauce. They would boil their tomato sauce, put the tomato sauce into a pre-hot jar, so they would have the jar already hot, pour it in, turn it upside down, put it in their oven at 200 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit for at least an hour, and then when they took them out, they considered it canned and on their shelf for 2, 3, 4 years. That, in my personal opinion, is absolutely not safe, because that kind of goes back to that video that we did on if it seals, you're good, and how that's not true. How we need the heat inside the jar to reach a certain temperature and then maintain that certain temperature depending on what food you have in your jars in order to kill off that bacteria. It's not just about getting a seal. And the oven canning method, if someone were to use that with something liquid like tomato sauce, you are just getting a seal. You're not necessarily getting heat enough for long enough in the center of the jar to kill off all risk of bacteria. So I just avoid oven canning completely, but I wanted to give you both sides of that story, the dry ingredients, the wet ingredients, and just give you my opinion of don't recommend doing it. There are so many safe ways to preserve our foods. Why risk it? Why introduce that worry in the back of your mind when you go to feed your family? Is this really safe? I don't have time for that in my life. I don't want that worry in my life. I want the food that I serve my family to be guaranteed safe and healthy. So I just don't risk it, and I don't recommend you do so as well. But your kitchen, do what you want. We're all adults here, right? Okay, method 3 is actual dry canning. So the term dry canning, when it is used correctly, is referring to this, and that is actually pressure canning, the way that we're supposed to, the way that we know is guaranteed safe, but instead of putting liquid in the jars, which we need to do for most foods, they don't put any liquid in them at all. And I think this is somewhat of a recent trend. Who knows, it may not be, but I remember I started reading about canning about 10 years ago, and since that time I never heard the term dry canning until like 2020, I think, when things kind of started going crazy. I think people started turning to food preservation methods and maybe not taking the time to research from reputable sources and just kind of going with what other people were doing on social media. And that's kind of how I think it got popular, because people didn't want mushy foods in their jars. So we all know that green beans and carrots, fresh out of the ground, fresh off the vine, are absolutely delicious, nice and crispy. And you lose that when you pressure can them. They turn a little bit mushy. So I think the rise of popularity of dry canning came from people wanting to avoid mushy foods. And I'm seeing dry canning mostly with vegetables, and even more specifically root vegetables like potatoes and sweet potatoes and even some carrots. So dry canning is actually pressure canning, but with no liquid in the jars. And here's why that's an issue. Well, first, let me do a little caveat. There are some recipes that don't require liquid because the food creates its own liquid as it cooks and cans, and that is raw meat mostly. I don't know that there's any other, I don't think there's any other food that you don't need water for except for raw meat, and that's because the raw meat releases its own juices and creates its own liquid broth as it cooks in the pressure canner. But definitely your vegetables and cooked meats, fruits, I mean, everything else that I can think of requires liquid. The reason why is because liquid conducts heat evenly. And that's a huge thing with canning, right? So the issue with when we're canning, We don't just need the heat to reach a high temperature along the edges or along the bottom or along the top. It's got to reach that high temperature enough to kill all that bacteria all the way through the center of the jar. And the jar is completely full, so it's totally full of mass, and that heat has to be able to penetrate and stay at that high temperature all the way to the center of the jar. And that's really hard to achieve when you don't have liquid, because like I said, liquid conducts heat. Air doesn't necessarily conduct heat near as well as liquid does. All of the testing that has been done on pressure canning vegetables has always been done with water. So that's another issue, is that we don't have any testing to see. They have that little tool that they drop inside the jar that sends them readings. We don't have anything that can tell us, is that dry air in the jar, is it conducting heat enough to reach those bacteria killing temperatures inside the center of the jar? So that's the main reason why dry canning is not considered safe. I'm never going to do it, and I don't recommend you doing it either. I understand not wanting mushy foods, but if that's the case, like you love potatoes, but you do not like canned potatoes, just dehydrate them. They work out fantastically. That's why we preserve both canning and dehydrated foods, because we like them different ways and different textures and stuff like that. So the alternative to not having mushy vegetables would be just dehydrate them instead, and not dry canning them. So if you hear the term dry canning, if it's used correctly, it's going to be referring to pressure canned items that don't have liquid inside the jars, and it is not safe. Some people will use dry canning to refer to oven canning, and again, it's not recommended because the glass jar can shatter, and it is certainly not recommended and not safe if you're putting liquid in the jars like tomato sauce. The third way people refer to dry canning is actually just putting dry goods inside mason jars and vacuum sealing them, and that is perfectly safe, and highly recommend that method of food preservation. Okay, y'all, I hope that was helpful to you. I hope I didn't confuse anyone any worse. Just trying to clear up some confusion that I've been seeing, and I hope that was helpful to you. We will see you next time. Bye.